Hello, this is our lecture on reasoning from the Cognition culture class. And today we'll talk about the way different factors like culture, but also language, schooling, literacy, all sorts of things of that kind could influence patterns of reasoning. So this is a very old question for anthropologists. It's a question that they've asked for a long time, which is, do people have different forms of reasoning in different places? And can we say that there is a sort of form of reasoning that is more or less sort of directed by the kind of language we speak, or the kind of institutions we have, or the kind of society we are in? So I will start with a sort of general background. You have readings from two sides of that discussion. From Kai-Pin Peng is someone who did very good studies in psychology on the apparent differences in reasoning between East Asian, Chinese, Japanese participants and American participants, and concludes that sometimes you find quite striking differences. And then you have an article by Hugo Mercier, who actually says that, well, in some of these cases, those differences are more apparent than real, and there's much less relativity than we think. So it's an old problem for anthropologists that, is it the case that different people speak differently? And, for example, in ancient traditions, it was quite clear that others not only thought differently, but they thought in a way that was not quite high quality. So the notion of barbarians, as you probably know, for the Greeks, there were people who don't speak Greek, but speak in a language that sounds like ba, so you call them barbarians. Was that they were not capable of the same kind of reasoning as the Greeks. But also, in classical Europe, for example, it would have been perfectly fine for people to say, or sort of perfectly obvious for people, that peasants did not have the same reasoning capacities as sophisticated urban population. Now, all this became a bit of a problem for Enlightenment anthropologists, philosophers, in times like the 18th century in Europe, where people thought that there was a unique human nature, and nature is the same, and all human beings are the same. But then there are cultural differences. So how do you explain cultural differences in the way people behave, but also in the way people think? And some of them sort of had, interesting ideas, like saying, well, maybe it's the climate, or maybe it's the history. But really the idea was, well, since all human beings are the same, we have to have some good theory of why thinking doesn't seem to be taking place in the same way in different cultures. And then there was a colonial perspective from Europeans, which was more or less the opposite of the classical Enlightenment perspective, in the sense that from a colonial viewpoint, the idea was that, these societies that we've conquered have different sort of reasoning capacities, and probably inferior reasoning capacities. So there's a white man's burden, that was the expression, to raise them to some sort of high quality thinking. And the idea was that they belonged to inferior races and inferior groups. That was sort of also expressed in more sophisticated terms by anthropologists when they talked about the notion of primitive thought. Primitive thought was supposed to be something that you find in small-scale traditional societies, or a primitive mentality, a pre-logical thought, symbolic thought that is not entirely rational. Those were the terms that people used. And the idea was that, for example, you have beliefs in magic, in the efficacy of ritual, which are typical of those societies, and that is evidence for the fact that people over there think in a way that is at least different from the way educated Westerners would think. And then anthropologists, of course, abandoned that notion for a simple reason, which was that the kinds of primitive thought, like belief in magic or belief in ritual, that were said to be so special to primitive thought, were in fact found in many of the societies where the anthropologists came from. So, you could sort of describe from, England the way Africans believed in divination, and but then you had to ignore the fact that in England lots of people resort to divination. So, these sort of primitive mentality kind of characteristics happen to be not typical of some societies. They're found everywhere. And in all cases, they're combined with practical rationality. That is to say, people who go see diviners or draw cards, they also apply sort of ordinary rationality in their everyday life, when they have to decide how to plow their fields or how to make a particular tool or things like that. And in any case, anthropologists also had this problem that saying that the whole category of people have a sort of primitive mentality or whatever does not explain anything about why they would have those particular beliefs that they have. It just tells you that, well, they have different kinds of beliefs. So instead of, we won't focus on the history of anthropology, let's look at what psychologists did of this. And here we have an interesting illustration of those debates. Case of Salvador Luria, who was a very distinguished Russian psychologist who contributed to lots of areas of psychology. But he was especially interested in forms of reasoning. And being a psychologist who worked in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, he had to use Marxist sort of theory simply because he was not allowed to use anything else. And in Marxist, sort of classical Marxist texts, you have an evolutionist scheme that says that, people evolve from primitive communist, quasi-communist communities to feudalism, to bourgeois capitalism, and then to socialism and communism. And the idea is that at each of these stages, you have different kinds of ways of thinking, ways of reasoning. So what Luria did was, I'm not sure he was convinced of the theory, but he was operating in a totalitarian sort of regime where he had to officially accept those things. But he was very much interested in the actual question of what are the differences in reasoning between different cultures. So he went to study those things in Uzbekistan, and Uzbekistan was sort of recently integrated into the Soviet Union and made into a Soviet Republic. And the idea was, well, in Uzbekistan we see lots of social change because there's industrialization, there's old feudal structures that are replaced with modern agriculture. And can we document any changes, or also can we document any differences between Uzbek ways of reasoning and Russian ways of reasoning? So he actually did lots of empirical studies in Uzbekistan. And the data from those studies are very interesting. I mean, he did lots of studies on perception, on reasoning. But what we'll look at is just one of the kinds of evidence that he got. And it was very simply that Luria would ask people syllogistic questions and ask them to answer them. So a syllogism would be something like, all cows are brown in Novaya Zemlya. So Novaya Zemlya is a place in northern Siberia that no one in Uzbekistan would know, but that doesn't matter here. All cows are brown in Novaya Zemlya. I saw a cow in Novaya Zemlya. What color was it? And he was very surprised that very few people said brown. Lots of people said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I'm sorry, I didn't go there. I didn't see that cow myself. I wish I could help you, but I wasn't there. And this pattern of answers is something that you find in lots of societies when you ask that kind of question. Another kind of syllogism that Luria asked was, there are no camels in Germany. The city of Bielefeld is in Germany. Are there any camels there or not? And the answer again was, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I don't know. I've never seen German villages. And people would say, well, if it was a large city, then there would be camels, because in a large city there are camels. But I told you there aren't any in all of Germany. And people sort of just go on and say, well, if Bielefeld is a small village, then maybe they don't have room for camels. But if it's a big city, they have room. So you see that people are not actually answering the question, so to speak. They seem to be addressing something else that's very different. But in any case, if I ask you, all A's are B and something is an A, is that A a B? I'm sure most of you, I hope all of you would answer yes. So there is something there that is kind of strange, because it seems the problem is extraordinarily simple. So Luria had an interpretation. I mean, he said, well, people don't seem to be addressing the abstract question that I'm asking. So maybe it's because they're not addressing the they do not activate sort of abstract thinking patterns. And he put that in Marxist terms, which again he probably didn't believe in, but that was the official theory, that it's because they lived in a feudal system that their cognition was strange. But there was other evidence that people did not really address the problems the way he wanted. Like, for example, he had this problem where he asked people, this is a display of 4 circles and 1 cross, and is there an odd one out in this picture? And it seems to us that it's perfectly simple to answer this question. But actually, lots of people said, well, I don't know, I'm sorry, I can't help you. Once again, I don't know about these things, I don't know what they are. Some of them had ingenious ways of saying, well, no, it will make sense because, you came in a car, the car has 4 wheels. If you have a problem with the car, if it breaks down, you need a pair of pliers. Where here's the pair of pliers. They made up a story, but they didn't answer the question. Also, Luria sort of documented the fact that people, when asked to name certain objects, would not identify geometrical figures, but would also always identify concrete objects that had those shapes. So, for example, people would not say, oh, yes, this is a circle, and that's not a circle. They would say, oh, this is a plate, and that is a smaller plate, or things like that. So is that the proper interpretation? Well, as it happened, it's probably not a good interpretation. And some psychologists after Luria tried to reinvent these things. But first of all, we have to realize that in all those cases, people found the same phenomenon. That is, it was replicated in Africa, but also in Mexico, South America, Fiji, etc. That a common pattern of answers was not what we would provide as an answer. All cows are brown. This is cow. Is it brown? Yes, it's. Oh, what color is it? Well, it's brown. They didn't do that. People typically said, no, I didn't see it. I'm not familiar with it. I don't know the situation. I'm sorry, I cannot help you. So why was that the case? Was it that people had a specific mode of living that seemed a bit strange, but why not? Was it that they focused always on empirical things? That seems a bit strange, because when you tell them about things that they are familiar with, like camels and things, they still do not answer the question the way we expect. Or is it the refusal to engage in counterfactuals? So, that people think this is a possible situation, it's not a real situation. No, because in many cases of syllogistic problems, people ask an actual state of fact. All the cows are brown in that village. So that seemed to be pretty bad. And some 2 psychologists, Sylvia Scribner and Michael Cole, were responsible for reopening this question and providing much better evidence. Sylvia Scribner, who is here, was a brilliant cross-cultural psychologist who did lots of studies of literacy, of cognitive development, and in Africa and also in other places. So when she was in Africa, Scribner and with Michael Cole, her student, used syllogistic problems with a special twist. What they would do is give people the problem and then pretend that they had a technical issue, like say, all cows in other villages are brown, in that other village are brown, I saw a cow in that other village, what color was it? And then say, oops, my tape recorder didn't work. So just now I've started again. Could you repeat the exact words that I used? And the result was extremely interesting, because the result was that almost no one repeated the problem the way she had stated it. People would typically say things like, "You told me you'd seen a brown cow in the other village, but you're not sure. You said all the cows were brown, asked me if I'd seen the brown cow." In other words, people were not even repeating the problem that she'd given them. It seemed that they could not remember that problem the way she remembered. But also notice that in these kinds of answers to this question, to this request to rephrase the problem, they all, and it was almost invariably the case, that people would actually say something that showed that they had resolved the problem and drawn the conclusion that she expected. So if you see these two green statements, both of them assume that the cow is actually brown. In other words, they have solved the problem, but they're incapable of repeating the problem. So why is that the case? Well, Scribner and Cole thought this is really interesting, because this was done in the Lai population of Liberia. Population of Liberia. And they thought, well, there may be an effect of something that has not been tested yet, which is the effect of literacy. And the Vai people would be a perfect example, because there are literate and illiterate people at the time that's in the 1970s. There were literate and illiterate people in Liberia, so you had all sorts of gradations. You had some people who were completely illiterate, they had no writing system. But then some were literate in a traditional script that had been invented by the Vai people a century before. That was a syllabary that had been invented that was only used to write the Vai language. Some were literate in Arabic because they went to Quranic school. And in Quranic schools, you have to learn your letters and you have to learn how to decipher the things. So you have literacy in Arabic. And some were literate in English because they went to the official Liberian school system, which is done in English and is very much like any school system in Europe or the Western world. So the idea was, well, if there's an effect of literacy, the performance should be the kind of wrong performance, what we call wrong performance that we just saw, these things like, oh, I'm sorry, I cannot help you, I can't solve this question, for illiterate people, but literate people would get it right. So they tested participants who had these different levels of literacy. This is the syllabary. So as I said, when people invent a script, they invent a syllabary very often. So this is the syllabary. It's a very refined system that is not really used anymore, but was used by the Vai for decades. So this is from the Quran, and it's and some Vai people learned how to decipher such texts, so they had literacy in that sense. And this is the book that they might have used, but it's not sort of maybe not the exact one they used in Liberia at the time. There was a primer in literacy that gave you your letters. So some kids and some adults had gone through schools that taught you that sort of thing. But they had strange results. So remember, the idea was that, well, if it's literacy that does it, once you have literacy, you provide the answer that we expect, which is, yes, it's a brown cow. But the illiterate subjects did give the wrong answer, like, I'm sorry, I wasn't there, I cannot help you with this question. But the people who had Vai literacy in the Vai script, as well as the people who had Muslim Arabic literacy from the Quranic school, they did the same as illiterates. So mostly the same. So they just said, I'm sorry, I cannot give you the answer. The ones who'd gone through Western style schools did give the answer the way we expect what we call the right result. So it looks like the effect, the transition or the change that makes you provide an answer to this kind of question that we see as appropriate is not literacy, but it's Western schools. And why would that be the case? So they saw that effect of Western schooling only after 2 or 3 years of schooling. The ones who'd done a bit less were not providing those responses. And also the effect didn't depend on how good they were at school. So it was not a question of success at school or intellectual achievement in any other domain. That made the difference. But why schooling? Well, most people answer those syllogisms with an answer like, I wasn't there, I don't know. But why is it that 2 or 3 years of schooling would do the case? Well, Scribner had a hypothesis which was supported by the evidence, which is that there's a very special style of schooling that is done in Western style schools that is not done in any other forms of instruction in oral transmission, and is certainly not the way it's done in most Quranic schools, which is that you have quizzing, as you guys know by from painful experience. A teacher provides quizzes, which means they provide answers to provide questions, the answer to which they should know because they're the teacher. And the students are supposed to know, but they might not know as well as the teacher since they're the students. So these assumptions are very weird if you think about it. It's the one who knows who pretends not to know. And it's the ones who are not in a position to know as well as that who are supposed to state what is the right answer to a question. It's a very weird thing if you think about it. And because we are over familiar with schools and the way they work, we don't think that that's the normal way. That's the way things work. The teacher says, x cubed, what's the derivative, and say it's 3x squared. And that's perfectly normal. The guy or the lady who knows everything about calculus is pretending not to know, and you who don't know much about calculus, you're asked to pretend that you know all there is to know about it. It's very special. Just because we've done 10, 15 years of it, that's made it very familiar, doesn't mean that it's not special in terms of human communication. That's not the way human communication works, usually. When you go around, so for example, you know that your friend went to a party, and you ask your friend, how was the party? It's not your friend who says, hey, I went to a party, tell me how it was. You who didn't go there. So that's not the way it works. So this pragmatics is very difficult it's very weird, and it takes a while to learn it. There was a case in Great Britain at some point that the lotto, had a really silly but funny sort of slogan, which was, buy a lottery ticket. Come on, last week, all the winners, they'd bought a ticket. So that was supposed to be a great argument for buying tickets. And of course, it's a kind of joke. But there were some people who did, the sort of interview of people in the street and asking them questions, who used that and would ask people out in the street, it's just, recently the lottery has claimed that last week all the people who won had bought tickets. Do you think that's true? And most people would say, no, of course not. It's stupid. Of course, no, it's not true. And then when they were pressed for details, they would say, well, of course it's not true that all the people who bought tickets won the lottery. So you see that it's very easy for people to not hear what they've just heard if what they've just heard does not make sense. Okay, so when I say all the people who won had bought tickets, that's not an argument for buying a ticket, obviously. So what you do, if you didn't hear very carefully, you rearrange it as something that would make sense, which would be a claim that all the people who bought tickets won something, and you can tell people, no, that's exaggerated. So this is just to say that the performance of people who, in Scribner's experiment, when they repeated the syllogism, they didn't repeat it. That's very natural. If something you've been told is something that could not possibly make sense, you repeat it in a way that makes sense, and you even recall it in a way that would make sense, rather than the way it actually was uttered. So these are very strange premises for a conversation. As I said, you don't go around asking people, how was this party for me, because I know you weren't there, so you should tell me. So training with this very strange style of pragmatics is something you do in Western schools. That is, in Western schools, from the get-go, you are constantly faced with a teacher who pretends not to know what they taught you, and you have to pretend to know that you're the one who can say what's what about this topic. So it takes years to get trained, but then you find it very natural. And I think that it's quite clear that people who provided these weird answers, like, I don't know, I wasn't there, like, you're told all the cows in the Amazamnia are brown, and I saw a cow there, what color was it? It's quite clear that for those people, for those participants in those studies, they tried to remember what the question was, and they thought, he's just said, or she's just said that she saw a cow that was brown, and she's asking me whether it's really brown. What color is it? So yes, one possible interpretation is she's not sure. She's asking me. Well, then the only rational answer is, how could I be sure if you're not sure about what you saw? How could I be sure when I wasn't there? So they provide the argument, which is, I wasn't there. So this special style of providing answers to a question is something that you learn from familiarity, being at school, and in some styles of schooling. When I say Western kind of schooling, that extends, of course, to East Asia, and most modern industrial societies do it that way. In the case of Liberia, it was just a European school, but or colonial, inspired by European models. But this is something that's very general to modern sort of schooling systems. The teacher does not just state stuff constantly. The teacher keeps asking questions, and now that we have this derivative, how do we factor it? Well, you're someone who teaches calculus, so they know how to factor it, but they take on the role of someone who doesn't know. So that would explain why you get this, not just why people don't solve the syllogism the way we expect, but also why they give those answers, which otherwise seem strange, to say, well, I wasn't there. So those answers make sense in that sort of thing. So it looks like it's not an effect of literacy, it's an effect of schooling, and of a certain kind of schooling. Another aspect of schooling that is important is when you elicit definitions, and you'll see that again, this is there's a difference between asking very simple questions like, what is a hammer, in a place where people have not been through formal schools, and a place where they have. A typical adult answer, if I ask people, what's a hammer, they will say, well, it's a heavy thing that you use to drive nails through wood, for example. So it has a head that's very heavy and a handle that's lighter, but it's strong. That kind of stuff. Very young children do not typically give you definitions for words. They will say, my dad had one, or I'm strong enough to use it. You can use it with nails, which is what people are called a thematic answer. That is, it talks about the kind of situation in which you would use those things, or this word would be relevant, but it doesn't tell you a definition in the sense of a dictionary definition. So, for example, what are twins? And children are very good at giving you characteristic features of things. So, for example, they mistakenly would say something like, yes, twin sisters have to wear the same clothes. I mean, they're not sure, but they've seen that happen sometimes. Do they live in the same house? In order to be a twin, do you have to live in the same house? Well, they say yes. Because in general, twins live in the same house. But they would not give you the actual dictionary definition, so to speak, of twins, which is, you know, two children born at the same time of the same mother. So Frank Kyle is a psychologist who's documented lots of stuff in cognitive development, but one thing that he documented was that schooling is one of the crucial variables there, in the sense that it's only with the influence of schooling that children once again acquire a special language game, which it consists in giving a formal definition of a word. Just like syllogisms, we are overtrained in that, okay, because we've been in school for many, many years or decades. The things that you have to remember that, once again, this is a very weird exercise. What is a hammer? The thing is that I'm speaking English and I'm asking you about what is a hammer. So either I speak English, in which case I know the meaning of the word hammer, or it means that I'm not asking you for a definition of the word. I'm asking you for something else. So it's more natural to say, well, a good hammer is one, you know, where the head is firmly attached to the handle. It's more natural than giving you a hammer is an instrument used, etc., etc. Because it seems strange that you would know, you know, when I ask you this question, you know, what is a hammer? It seems strange that I know all the words of English except this one. So for everyday words, it seems very strange and paradoxical to ask for definitions. And children naturally don't give definitions, but most people who've not been through a school system do not give definitions. They give characteristic features, like, you know, a good one will cost you lots of money, or thematic ones, you know, well, if you're in a shop and you have to have several types of hammers, that kind of thing. So again, we see here an effect which is not an effect of literacy, but is an effect of schooling. Sheila Walker, who is a cross-cultural developmental psychologist, did lots of studies in Nigeria with Yoruba children, and did studies with both sort of elite populations in Nigeria and rural populations, and compared them to so-called elite populations, that is middle-class people in the United States, and underprivileged children who had very, very little schooling, adults and children who had very little schooling in remote and rather poor places in Appalachia. And she found exactly the same pattern, that, you know, the isolated rural communities are exactly like rural Nigeria, in the sense that when you ask people what is a hammer, they don't give you a definition, they give you characteristic features. And the elite kids in Nigeria, in cities who've gone through lots of, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 years of schooling, they're providing the same answers as the middle-class kids in the US. In other words, once again, we see that there's an effect of institutions of communication. You know, schooling is a special institution, much more than literacy or cultural differences, in the sense that the Nigerian kids and adults react in the same way as the American kids and adults, so that there's no difference of culture in reasoning, but there's a great difference in the impact of schooling. So, as you will see in Hugo Mercier's article, as you have seen because you've read it, it makes a lot of. It's very important to understand when we look at, you know, reasoning and why we have certain patterns of reasoning and why it varies with certain effects of institutions. It matters to understand, why do we have reasoning at all? You know, why do people reason? And the standard classical assumption for many centuries was that, well, we have reasoning to get to truth. So, for example, I know that this cow is from Novaya Zemlya, and I know that all the cows of Novaya Zemlya are brown. So this cow that I haven't seen yet, I have an expectation that it's going to be brown, and I can be confident because I've reasoned the right way from syllogism. Now, the problem is that there's lots of ways in which psychologists have shown that, well, people very often use reasoning not to get to a better solution for a problem or be closer to truth, basically, but also to justify their beliefs or to not accept other people's beliefs. So, for example, if you're persuaded of a certain sort of political sort of, for example, opinion, you'll find that the minute a contrary opinion is uttered in your presence, your mind comes up with dozens of reasons why this, for example, these facts that don't sort of are not coherent with your opinion, those facts must be dismissed. Either that the source is not reliable, or that the facts are very dubious, or that the facts are there but they don't show what the person thinks they show, etc. So we're extremely good at this kind of what's called motivated reasoning, where we are motivated to reach a certain point and we find the tools we need to get there. But if you think about it, motivated reasoning really clashes with the idea that we have reasoning in order to get a better understanding of the world. So Mercier and Sperber and other people have proposed that actually reasoning evolved to be able to track in what other people are saying what is deceptive or low quality information and what is good quality information. And of course, it has that side effect that if we have prior beliefs that certain things will be true, we go through all the movements, the moves to get there. But also it means that we are very suspicious of people's arguments, even if we don't have priors, when those arguments are of poor epistemic quality. It also means that we're extremely good at accepting other people's conclusions when actually we're provided with a good reason. I'll give you an example of that. So the predictions from that account of reasoning from argument is that if you create a situation in which there are lots of people together and you make it possible for one person to find a good reason for saying A rather than B, then this belief will spread in the group regardless of those prior beliefs, because people have an advantage in acquiring better beliefs from others. Okay, so the idea is that reasoning is mostly to check, to filter, so to speak, all the information provided by others and see what is garbage and what is valuable information. So to show that, you can use simple sort of problems that seem simple but are actually super difficult to solve unless you're given the solution. So there are lots of logical problems that are very difficult to solve, but in fact, once you have the solution, it's completely obvious what the solution was. So again, I give you an example. Jack is looking at Anne. Anne is looking at George. This is a situation where Jack cannot see George. Okay, so Anne is looking at Anne. Okay, Anne is looking at George. So Jack, who's married, is looking at Anne, and Anne is looking at George, who's not married. And the question is that you have to solve is a married person looking at an unmarried person in this situation? There are three possible answers. One is yes, there's a married person looking at an unmarried person. So that's no. And the third answer, that's, well, we don't know, we need more information about this situation. So let you think for a minute. Jack, married, is looking at Anne. We don't know anything about her. Anne is looking at George, who's not married. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? Mystery. Lots and lots of participants answer, we don't have enough information. We cannot answer that. And that's, unfortunately, is the wrong answer. The right answer is, as I'm sure many of you have determined, the right answer is yes. And the right answer is yes for a simple reason, which is Anne could be married or she could be unmarried. We don't know. But if she's married, she's looking at someone who's not married. So the answer is yes. And if she's not married, this guy who's married is looking at her, so a married person is looking at an unmarried person. So whether she's married or not, it's true that a married person is looking at an unmarried person, but in both cases, in either case, it's a different person. So that's the sort of problem. So these are the kind of problems that most people fail, because there's a trick in the problem, which is to tell you that we don't know about Anne, and then provide a situation where you're not sure about the answer, so you connect those two facts and you think, well, surely it's because we don't know enough that so the answer is cannot be determined. But the interesting thing about those things is that even though very few people would spontaneously find the answer, if you have groups with more than a certain number of people, at some point someone will hit on this. But the thing that's interesting is that when those things are discussed in group, you suddenly revert from most people thinking it cannot be determined to most people thinking, oh, the answer is yes. In other words, everyone is convinced once they've heard the explanation. Almost everyone is convinced. And all sorts of people who had not thought about the problem suddenly see it in that way, and then don't see how you could see it in any other way. So you have these situations in which reasoning is something that seems to be used in such a way that individual reasoning is not great, but once you get the input from other people, then your reasoning is much better. Or you can accept something that you did not accept before. So this is an interesting case because it shows that when you have difficult reasoning tasks like that, reasoning can get to sort of better access to information if you remove all the priors, so people do not have reasons to believe one way or the other about this question, but also there's nothing at stake for them. In the sense that, if you answer yes on or we need more information, well, that doesn't change anything to your life or to anything that matters for you. So in such cases, you see that persuasion is very easy, but it also shows that epistemic psychology, the psychology of belief and constructing belief, is constructed in such a way that we are convinced by good evidence and good reasoning. In other words, epistemic reasoning or epistemic psychology is not just about rejecting the deceptive information that others could give us, but it's also about accepting the good information that they can give us. We all know that in everyday life there's lots of detection of deception, and that people are, if someone tells you, you should go out with me because I'm absolutely fantastic and a great person and so on and so forth, and everyone who knows me finds me incredibly funny, smart, charming, and intelligent and pleasant, etc. If you will say that, you know how to dismiss that because you know that that is a form of deception, probably, or it might be. And in any case, it matters. So if it's deceptive, it's not entirely true, then there's a cost for you to pay. So you immediately scrutinize this kind of message, and you say, well, no, I sort of suspend belief in that. And symmetrically, when there's an interest in having the right answer, and someone's giving you the right answer, and it's not clear that they have any interest in you believing it, it's just that they provide the answer, you accept it. Okay, so these are sort of various aspects of reasoning that we've been sort of looking at that sort of go around this sort of question, are reasoning capacities different in different places or cultures? And as we said, sometimes you have what could be called different performance. That is, people's answer to a similar question or a similar problem would be different. But that doesn't mean that the capacities are different or even the style of thinking. It just means that there is an effect of some institutions, for example, that may have made some patterns of reasoning more natural than others. So we saw the effect of schooling, learning a very weird pragmatic style. Pragmatics is the sort of psychology of how conversation works and how you exchange information in conversation. So once you've learned a style of pragmatics in which it makes perfect sense for the person who does not know to ask the ones who don't really know yet or not very well, then you've learned that trick, that sort of game. and it's possible to, but it's not, doesn't mean that you've changed in terms of cognitive reasoning capacity. The underlying cognitive capacities seem similar because, as we saw in the syllogistic example, people who supposedly do not solve the syllogistic problem, like those African non-schooled people, unschooled people that Severus Scribner was studying, they actually have solved the syllogism. And their answers show that they think the cow is definitely brown. So they wonder what else she might be possibly talking about, because that fact is clearly done. So they've run so the cognitive capacities are similar, but they're displayed in different ways. So cognition is always contextual. So that means that you have relevance effects of this kind. So when some people are asking you about a problem, what is exactly the problem and what do we know about it, or what information is that person seeking, is very important. Now, these are all sort of relevant aspects of these differences. Now, the readings from Nisbet and Kai-Ping Peng and Mercier look at something much more specific. Nisbet and Morris said that, well, in general, when you test people from America and from, it's mostly China and Japan, on different kind of problems, you often get a slightly different kind of answer. And in some further lectures, we'll talk about some of those differences in terms of societies that privilege sort of individual viewpoints on personality, for example, as opposed to more interactive, holistic viewpoints. So Nisbet and Peng say that, well, what we find is that very often the performance is different for similar problems. And I must say, I mean, many of those effects are actually right. I mean, Nisbet and Peng did not sort of make this up. And the other article by Mercier is only about one particular point of their studies. There are those differences. It's not always clear to understand where those differences come from. Peng and Nisbet say, well, there is a general intellectual style. Many anthropologists have said, well, that's all very well, but it's a bit like saying that things are different because they're different. It's not really an explanation. We may want something a bit more precise. Now, the reading by Hugo Mercier is a bit special because it looked at only one question, which was, do people handle contradictions differently? And what Mercier shows is that, well, in some cases, at least in the case of contradictions, you mustn't be go so fast and go too fast and say that we find a difference, because sometimes it's mostly the kinds of stimuli you use that triggers that difference, and the difference is not so much in the ways people reason. So in that sense, we have to be a bit nuanced, that there are sort of effects that point to a sort of more relativistic sort of idea about modes of thinking, modes of reasoning, that yes, there are differences that we find. As I said, we will document more of those differences as we go along. However, the Mercier article is very good in telling us, well, you have to be clear sometimes whether you're testing competence or performance, so to speak. That is, competence is the set of stuff that you could do. That is, you have all the tools in your mind to do. And performance is what tools you actually use when you're given a certain problem. And it might be the case that just like syllogisms, people have the tools to solve the syllogism, but they find the question so absurd that they don't use it. I mean, they use it to solve the syllogisms, but then they don't answer the way we expect. It could be the same for contradictions, that there are ways in which people handle the contradiction in the same way in East Asia and in America. but actually they just have a sort of style that makes them react slightly differently to stimuli that seem to be the same, but actually are not the same because there are subtle differences that work as differences in those two cultures. Also, incidentally, I must say that many of those studies that people like Nisbet and others did were on China, the West kind of differences. And that was, of course, very reductive because there are people that do not live in China or in America. And also even more reductive, the thing was that those studies were mostly based on East Asian students, mostly in China, mostly at Beida, that is the Peking University, and many undergraduate, middle-class white students in some universities, in sort of the high-level universities, just like Beida is a high level in China. So that may be a factor that triggered some sort of differences that would not be found if you tested people from Africa, South America, from rural populations, and so on and so forth. So the study of all these differences is only starting, and it has some interesting results, like what Peng and Nisbet did. It has some problems, like Mercier pointed out. So that's all for today, and we'll see you very soon. We have a quiz coming, and I will send some more instructions and details about that very soon. But as you know, there's nothing to worry about, really. Thank you.